we go. Today, I am so excited to be joined by my special guest, Dr. Stephanie Estima. She is an expert in metabolism and body composition. She's particularly focused on distilling strategies in nutrition, movement, and mindset, actualized human potential, longevity, and achievement. And she is the host of Better podcast. She is going to help us midlife women understand what is going on with our hormones and how we can get rid of that pesky belly fat. Welcome, Dr. Estima.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, it's really interesting because when we get pregnant, we have no problem talking about our bodies and the changes we're going through. We talk to our moms, we talk to our girlfriends. But, once we hit midlife, it feels like it's a taboo topic. And we don't want to talk about menopause or hot flashes or what's happening with our bodies. Could you please help us with the basics, like what is going on with our hormones and our bodies during this time?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because I think, 5, 10, even just like 5, 10 years ago, this was just a taboo subject. This was just like, you have to deal with it. It's part of aging. And there wasn't really an open and honest and transparent dialogue around what happens to women. And women, I don't think there was a lot of support groups. So, just thank you for running a podcast like this because it allows for dialogue and it allows women to be empowered to make better decisions around their health. And that's kind of what it's all about, right? So just as a, quick and dirty back of the envelope crash course in perimenopause, some of the things that are, there's a lot of changes that can happen as we start moving towards our 50s, but around your mid 30s, so around the age of 35, we start to see progesterone start to decline. So this is a hormone that shows up in the second half of our menstrual cycle. I always call her like the princess of the luteal phase because she is involved. It's if you break down the word progest, it's progestation. It's your pro pregnancy hormone. So this is whether or not you want a baby. She's coming. So she is going to stimulate your appetite. She's helping the corpus luteum, which is the what used to be the follicle, continue to develop the endometrial lining. And then, a couple days before your period comes, progesterone takes like a nosedive. So there's no fertilized egg, progesterone drops, and then we get our period. So at the age of about 35, we start to see a stepwise decline in progesterone. And why that's important is in addition to some of those functions that I just mentioned as it pertains to your menstrual cycle, progesterone is really important for brain health. She is the chilled out. She's a GABA, there's a neurotransmitter in the brain called GABA. It's like helps us chill out, helps us sleep, all those things. Progesterone helps with that. So in mid 30s, early 40s, sometimes women will start to say, all of a sudden I can't sleep. Like I can't sleep the way I used to. Or they may notice that their anxiety levels are starting to creep up or their depression, they're starting to feel much more moody. And when we think about this in the context of our menstrual cycle, when your progesterone is low, your PMS game is going to be strong. So you're going to have a lot of that PMS type of like the moodiness, the sleep disturbances, potentially some of the cramping, all of that stuff that can happen leading up to your period. And what that does is because progesterone is not the only hormone in that second phase, we also have estrogen. Estrogen normally should also be sort of have a relatively sustained release in that luteal cycle. But what happens is once progesterone gets low enough, then your estrogen levels are actually going to be higher than your progesterone. And this is what, the lay person might call estrogen dominance, which is not it's actually a pretty good term. The correct way of capturing what's happening is estrogen dominance relative to progesterone in the luteal phase of your menstrual cycle. But no one's going to say that all day long. So we just say estrogen dominance. So that estrogen dominance, again, weight gain, moodiness, depression, anxiety, all the things that, are, would be considered undesirable weight, like water gain, like, women will say like, I can't get my rings on, I feel like bloated and distended in my gut, all of those things. So that's sort of the first phase of perimenopause. And this is with a sort of an estrogen dominant, signature. As we move beyond our mid 40s, so call it 45, 46, 47, then the hormonal landscape begins to change again. So now we start seeing estrogen dropping along with progesterone. Testosterone starts to drop as well as your body is preparing. Your ovaries are like, listen, I've been working for 30 years. Like I'm done. So we start to see all of those sex hormones drop. And then now we have a different hormonal environment with lowered estrogen. So there's sort of two, I always talk about sort of two main phases of perimenopause, like estrogen dominance, where it's hot, like estrogen is higher relative to progesterone. And then when estrogen starts to drop as well. So those are sort of things that we can expect. But the good news is that that's all normal and natural. Like you're not going to be able to stop that. But what we can do is we can be looking at some really powerful lifestyle modifications that can help with supporting hormonal balance, supporting our moods, supporting our body composition and our metabolism, which I'm sure we're going to get into. But one of the things I love to talk about is food as a proxy for healing. Like it's one of the most powerful medications. It's free for everyone. You get to choose what you take. And then the other thing would be, movement therapy. So hopefully we'll get to talk today about resistance training and different types of cardio and different types of things during your menstrual phase, but your menstrual cycle. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell what happens in perimenopause.
Well, thank you so much for breaking that down. I have to say, a lot of times I just feel like I'm crazy. Like, why am I feeling this moody or, what's going on? So to actually know that there's a reason behind it, that it's not just all in our heads. And
Right.
speaking about this is so comforting. So thank you for laying it all out there for us, breaking it down. Um, Now, I love that you talk about food as medicine because we are losing, well, not everyone, but some of the symptoms are like losing hair,
Right.
um, brittle fingernails, brain fog, our
Correct.
skin's changing. So, what are your thoughts on helping us with those symptoms?
In terms of food, you mean?
Yes, in terms of food. Yeah.
So, one of the things I think that we have been, again, talking about like 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I grew up, I'm totally dating myself. I'm giving y'all my age, but like I grew up in that like high carb, low fat. That was like the big thing. And we were really taught that fat was quite detrimental. It was going to cause atherosclerosis and heart disease and, all this cerebrovascular, cardiovascular stuff. Like that was all going to be as a direct result from eating fat and more specifically saturated fat. That was like enemy number one. You would see people saying like if you're going to eat eggs, just do the egg whites. When you go for brunch, you pay extra for the egg whites, right? But what we know now from the data is that fat is actually not the culprit. Fat is not why we have skin changes. Fat is not why we have atherosclerotic changes, or it is what, and I will quantify that by saying like there is a small proportion of the population that is exquisitely sensitive to fat, but for the most part, like 80 to 90% of the population, we should be having more fat than we are. The real problem is excess carbohydrates, and more specifically, when you are consuming more carbohydrates, especially processed carbohydrates like the chips, the cookies, I mean anything in the grocery aisle, not the perimeter of the grocery store, but when you're in the grocery aisles, some of these processed foods, that is actually what causes the liver to create more triglycerides, more of these very low density lipoproteins, and more generally, broadly speaking, a more insulin resistant environment, because the more carbohydrates that you are that you are consuming, carbohydrates break down into an energy substrate called glucose. So we always hear this when we think about diabetics, they talk about their blood glucose, right? So whenever you eat any carbohydrate, whether it's a vegetable, a fruit, a cookie, a cracker, whatever, it breaks down into blood glucose. And now the body's job because if you just have glucose kind of running around in the blood, that can actually be quite deadly. So insulin's job here is like, okay, I see extra blood glucose, let me take it and plop it into some cells so that those cells can use it for energy, which is, you and I are talking right now, our cells are creating ATP, or the energy currency, in order for us to, function and live. So the more you rise insulin, there is this sort of paradoxical down regulation of insulin sensitivity. So the more insulin you have, the less your cells are actually sensitive to it. It's I always talk about it, and that can sound a little bit like wordy and sciencey and snotty, but what I mean by that, like, if you when you first when you first hear a song on the radio and you're like, god, I love this song, right? And then you listen to it 5 times, 10 times, 50 times, and you're still like, kind of like, this is the best song ever. And then, like, at maybe like time 100, you're like, well,
I'm a little
for,
tired of
yeah,
that
a
song.
little tired of that song. And then by,
Right.
song 150, you're like, make them stop playing the song. That's actually what's happening with your cells. The more you bathe your cells in insulin, the less sensitive they are to the effects of insulin. So what I really like as a means for helping women control their hormones, in particular that metabolic hormone insulin, is to eat a higher fat diet. So for someone who grew up in in the era that I did, that high carb, low fat, this is going to be like super radical and be like, oh my God, what is she saying? But higher fat, moderate protein, and then lower carbohydrate, or what I would call a carbohydrate appropriate diet. Like, our ancestors weren't, taking boxes. Like, when we go to the store now, even if we buy healthy carbohydrates, if we have, we buy raspberries and blueberries, and we don't, like, our ancestors didn't get 40 blueberries, right, in a pint, right? They would pick up
Right.
3 or 4, whatever the bush was flowering. Same is true for spinach, right? So there was only a certain time of the year that you were able to, grow these vegetables. We weren't able to just, go to Whole Foods, or, whatever grocery store
Right.
you shop at, and just pick up 3 or 4 pints of blueberries. Like, that's just not how it
Well,
was.
I love how you're talking about portion size, because I think that has a lot to play with it as well. But I
Correct.
love too how you're talking about, because I grew up as well. And most of the people listening to this podcast, where fat isn't good. And it seems like, I mean, fat free this, fat free that.
Oh yeah.
Remember that? But
Yeah.
they supplemented it with sugar.
Well, that's the scary thing. It's like, when you take fat out, what they actually put in, because fat is very tasty, right? It's very satiating. It makes us feel full for a really long period of time. But when you take the fat out, you have to make the food taste good. So they would put in sugar substitutes, like, the sort of fake sugar, like the aspartame, the sucralose, the all those things,
Yeah.
because they're trying to get a chemical response from you in order
Mhm.
to buy that food again. Right? So I would much rather you have a full fat yogurt. Maybe you have a berry or two, whatever, some flax seeds on top, and that's going to keep you full for hours on end, rather than, you go and you have your fat free blueberry yogurt. You have this incredible quick insulin rise. So you have your sugar, because, simple sugars are very easily converted into glucose. So you have this, astronomical rise in insulin. So your insulin's like busy kind of taking all the blood glucose, putting it away into the cells. And then what happens? You become almost hypoglycemic. And then you're 45 minutes later, you're like, God, I'm like, I need something else. Like, I need to go and get a bagel now. I need to go and get a cup of coffee. I need to go get something, so that you can rev up your energy.
Well, then we also crash. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but we crash about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're
Mhm.
reaching for caffeine and needing some kind of a boost,
Right. Right. Well,
later
I
in the
would
day.
say, yeah, I mean, it really, when you change the macronutrient composition of your diet, so macronutrients is just a fancy way of categorizing like fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. When you are eating good quality proteins, I mean, protein is very satiating, it's very filling, and so are fats. When the bulk of your diet is going to be fats and proteins, that 2 to 4 o'clock crash that you're referring to is no longer going to be, a really big issue, because you can actually go for many, many hours without eating. And that's the other sort of fallacy. When I was growing up, it was like 5 to 6 meals a day, like, eat every couple of hours to stoke the metabolic fire. But what that's doing, again, is it's just rising insulin. You're just rising insulin 3, 4, 5, 6 times in a day versus having, in the 1960s and 70s, it was like 3 square meals, right? You had breakfast, you had lunch, and you had dinner. And now in, this era, 2021, 2020, we are seeing that people are eating all the time. Like we have those, they call themselves grazers. Like I just graze all day. I have a little bit of this, I have a little bit of that. But that's actually you need to allow your digestive system to rest. But in order to do that, you need to give yourself the nutrients that you need to heal your digestive system. And that, of course, is proteins and fats.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I can remember, going in the office and when we have meetings, there's always food. They always have cookies and everything. But back in the 70s, they never used to, they just used to meet,
Right. Well,
and
that's expensive, right? So they'll give you like cookies and muffins and bagels. Like that's relatively cheap. Like that's just flour, some sugar, water, maybe some eggs. I mean, those resources are actually relatively easy to find. Whereas, a really good quality meat, if you're, giving them even like processed meats, like smoked meats and roast beef and salami, like those are more expensive than, a dozen bagels.
right, exactly. Well, I like how you're also talking about not eating all the time and
Yes.
fasting. And I know
Yes.
you're a big proponent of that. Could you explain that a little bit more to us?
Oh, yes, I would love to. I love talking about fasting. So when we think about fasting, I think first of all, psychologically, I think there's a bit of a resistance to it, right? Because we equate fasting, not eating, you're going to be starving, and there's still this myth that persists around going into like starvation mode, which is there's no such thing as starvation mode in the body. I mean, there are certain when you are complete when, if you are someone who has grown up in maybe a third world country without consistent access to food, yes, there's going to be muscle wasting and cachexia at the very late. And but for most of us living, if you are listening to this podcast, it's very likely that you are living where you can go to the grocery store. Within a 30-minute to 45-minute drive. You probably have an app on your phone that can bring food to your home within 30 minutes as well. So this is not really a concern for I would call this like first world problems, right? So when we think about um when we think about fasting, what we're talking about is just eating in an appropriate window of time. So we're not necessarily changing what you eat, although changing what you eat might be beneficial to your health when we were just talking about the macronutrients. But let's just say you did nothing. You're like, I'm not giving up my fat free blueberry yogurt, but we just changed the hours in which you consumed your food. You would also see profound benefits in your physiology, in your ability to lose weight, in your ability to focus, your sleep. So most Americans, most Canadians, most North Americans, we can kind of lump them into one group. We are basically eating from the time we wake up to the time that we go to sleep. So we wake up, we have a cup of coffee, we have our breakfast, we kind of get on with our day, and then in the evening, we maybe have dinner with the family, or we have dinner by ourselves. And then later into the evening, we have a glass of wine, maybe we have a snack, we have a late night dessert, all these opportunities to continue this feed cycle when really we have two main ways of producing energy. One is in the fed state. So we've talked about that a lot. Like insulin is the hormone of the fed state. You eat, insulin's going to rise and put the food that you've eaten into your cells. The other way that you create energy is in the fasted state. So all the stored, if you have any excess, I mean, we all do, we all have excess adipose tissue. It's like no one's ever like 0%, right? So I like to think about adipose tissue as stored potential energy. And that's what it is. It's just stored energy for a rainy day or for a fasting day. So if you are not eating like overnight, we all fast every night, right? We're not eating consistently over the course of over the evening. Your body now will go into your fat stores, go into your liver and your muscle stores for so glucose is stored as glycogen in the body. So your liver and your muscles are the main depots for glycogen. So your body will go in there and use up those glycogen stores to continue to create energy. That's why you wake up every day, because your body has been creating energy. Your heart is beating, liver is working, pancreas is working, all the things. So when we are in a fasted state, now we can activate different pathways that are going to be more um, appropriate for fat loss. And actually, let me just back up 1 second because we want to talk about I have a lot of women that come to me and they want to talk about weight loss, but we actually want to distinguish between weight loss and fat loss. It's usually the fat that they're referring to. Like, you don't want to lose organ weight. You don't want to lose muscle. You want to preserve those things. But what we want is we actually want to lose adipose tissue. And one of the most powerful ways to do that on the planet is through fasting. And it doesn't have to be like 10 days, like it doesn't have to be for a year. It can be really every single day where you are still eating, but you're just tightening up the eating window in which you're doing so. So, a lot of women, I will start, if you've never done fasting before, I love for people to start off in a 12-hour fast. So, if we include your sleep, let's like pinky promise that you're sleeping 8 hours, right? So now if you're going to try to fast for 12, you've already done 8 through your sleep, and then you just need 4 more. So you can maybe delay your breakfast by 2 hours and then bring your dinner up or your last meal up by 2 hours. And there's your 12. And, when you think about it in a practical sense, it's actually super, like, you wake up, let's say you eat at 7 in the morning, you have all the way until 7 p.m., right? It's not that difficult. And that's appropriate for most women.
That's great. And, with our hormones, we do seem to get this extra belly fat. I'm not exactly quite sure what is going on with that. So, do you think because in midlife, a lot of us have thyroid issues,
Mhm.
is all of this eating more properly and fasting going to help us with that belly fat and with our thyroids?
Yeah, I would say that when I see a woman, and I see a lot of women will come to me and say, listen, doc, I am tracking my food. I'm doing the keto, like I'm doing the 70% fat that you want me to do. I'm working out every day, but I still can't seem to nudge, like this belly fat will not seem to budge. Usually this is because a woman is chronically stressed. And this is another metabolic hormone called cortisol, or it is several hormones, but the main one is cortisol. Another one is what's known as adrenaline or epinephrine. So when you are in a chronic stressed out state, this is a branch of your nervous system called the sympathetics. So this is, if you've ever heard of the term fight or flight before, like your stress response, what happens is now your whatever threat, whether it's perceived or it's real. So, back in our ancestral days, it might have been a bear or a tiger, right? Today, it might be, oh, I have to slam on the brakes really quickly, or oh my God, my toddler's running out into track. Like, I got to get her before, she hurts herself. Your body has this exquisitely brilliant pathway, which is called your stress. It's your stress pathway. It's your hypothalamic pituitary axis or adrenal axis. And it is going to pump out cortisol into the body. This keeps glucose away from the cells. So we were talking before about insulin trying to take all the glucose from the cells and put them away. Cortisol is like, no, 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 no. We need the glucose. We need to put this into her muscles so that she can fight the like the target or flight, run away, right? So, when we constantly have cortisol elevated, the metabolic environment turns in. So, you basically have like insulin and cortisol fighting each other all the time because insulin's like, no, all this blood glucose, we got to put it away. And cortisol's like, no, we got to keep it. We got to keep it here just in case, right? So, what ends up happening is you actually become insulin resistant. It's something called insulin mediated insulin resistance. It's too much insulin. And then your cells are like, okay, we can't deal with this. So you tend to now store adipose. You tend to not be able to get into your adipose tissue. Remember, we were just talking about the fasting and how fasting opens up the fat cells. We start pulling out the triglycerides, breaking them down and using them for energy. That shuts completely off when you are chronically stressed. So often, like when I hear belly fat or like that weight through the tummy or like even in through the hips and the bum that won't move, it's usually cortisol. So a woman might talk about a job that she's not really loving, or maybe it's a partner who's stressing her out, or a family member, or there's unresolved trauma of some sort from her past. That could be maltreatment as a child. It could be anything from, low level or little t trauma to big T trauma. So emotional, sexual abuse, any of those things that is still residing in her nervous system that is now precluding her from losing the weight that she wants. So,
So, how do we get rid of cortisol or how do we manage cortisol? Because I have heard that quite a bit with a lot of my clients and midlife women. Because, right now, us Gen X women, we're in the sandwich generation where a lot of us still have younger kids,
correct.
and a lot of us have kids on the spectrum,
Hmm.
which is really stressful,
Really stressful.
really
Yeah,
stressful. And then we'll have aging parents,
correct.
and then we're working and trying to balance all of life.
Right.
So, how can you help us with that?
I think there are many. This is like maybe another entire podcast in and of itself, but I would say the very first step is to acknowledge that it's there. A lot of times we want to, and I did this for years as well. So I would like to. I used to pretend that I was a male, not a female, and I'd be like, no, I'm just going to punch through. It doesn't matter that my period's coming, and like I'm just going to do the thing. I got to do the thing, and I think not like first saying, you know what, this is really hard. Like my I have a child who's on the spectrum. He's having challenges. I'm having challenges. This child is, as much as we love him or her, is putting stress on my marriage. My marriage is difficult. We have financial issues. Mom's aging, has is having health issues, all the things. Just acknowledge that this is really difficult. And one of the biggest things that I have found useful for me, well, there's two things, is talking to myself. Like, I know that this is hard, Steph. Like, I know you're doing the absolute best that you can. And while that might sound a little funny, and sometimes I'll say it out loud, like sometimes it's just me and my having a conversation in my head, but often I'm talking out loud. And the art and the grace of self compassion, I think, is something that's really lost. Like, we just are like, God, this is so hard. I got to find a way to get to the end of it. I got to find the solution. But M maybe a healthier perspective, in addition to trying to find the solution, is also recognizing the toll that it's carrying on you, or that how difficult this really is. And when you have more self-compassion for yourself, rather than the punitive voices in your head that are like, God, you're just not doing enough. You're not being the mom. You're not doing the wife thing. You're not, like, everything you're not doing is right. If we could balance that voice with another voice that's like, I know you're doing your best. I love the effort that you put in today. I know you're trying with all the tools that you have, and I love you for it. If we could just balance that voice out a little bit, I think that now begins to get us out. When we're thinking about this from a neurological perspective, of course, you're moving out of your limbic brain, which is deals in absolutes. It's like, you never do this, you always do this, she always does this, he always does this. Now you move into your prefrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain that is part of the frontal lobe, executive decision maker, thinks about the future. But an important part of the frontal lobe is actually dampening the result, there's an inhibitory effect on these lower brain centers that are always talking about, like, you're not good enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, you're not this, you're not that, you're not this. So when your frontal lobe is smart, like stronger, it can more strongly inhibit, it can silence these more negative, more punitive voices. So self-compassion would be the first thing. And then to layer on top of that, I'm sure you've had guests on the podcast before that have talked about the importance of meditation. And again, this is a frontal lobe flex. I talk about, like, you want to flex like your biceps, good. The other thing you should be flexing is your frontal lobe, because the stronger that you, like, meditation has been shown in the literature ad nauseum at this point, how much of an effective change it makes on dampening your sympathetic nervous system, because you're strengthening your frontal lobe.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It has such a big impact. So, in addition to as we are aging, you talk about chronic cardio and
Mhm.
also the importance of muscle strength. Could
Correct.
you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we touched on it a little bit when I was sort of describing the woman that's like, "Hey, I'm working out every day." And, like, usually when we dive a little deeper into what she's doing, she's usually doing some sort of cardio. every single day, and she's like spinning her little heart out or running her butt off, and it's this chronic cardio that's done in a way that is more of a high intensity interval training way. And there's before I kind of go on, like people are like, what? That's like the best type of exercise. And it is, except if you are already stressed, which I would like in my, when I work with women, it's like you are stressed until proven otherwise, right? Like you have to demonstrate to me that you're not. But when we are now adding on this acute, because stress, exercise is a stress, it is a hormetic stress, meaning that it is a, short term, it's pro-inflammatory, but long term, it actually gives you all the, the cardiovascular benefits and the lean muscle mass and, the focus and all the things, better blood flow and all that. But in the short term, it's actually a stressor. So if you are always having this acute stress, so you're, going to, whatever class, Peloton, whatever, and then they're just telling you to just like ride until your legs fall off, which is usually, like those are the ones that type A personalities tend to be drawn to. It's like, give me the hard stuff. I want the hard, right? So you go to these crazy classes and then you do the same thing the next day. So you're not giving yourself the time to recuperate and to recover before you actually go and add on that stress again. And we all know that, or maybe we don't want to acknowledge it, but all of our gains when it comes to the gym happens in our recovery. So it's not actually when you're lifting the weights. It's not actually when you're spinning on the bike. It's not when you're doing the run. It's actually the recovery part that gives you the physiological advantage. And if you don't allow yourself to recover, then your body starts to think, God, there is an imminent danger here. I don't know why every single day at 9 o'clock, I have to spin for my life, right? So you start holding on to fat. You start protecting and defending your fat stores because you think that this is a chronic acute, like this is a chronic high level of stress that you're engaging in every single day or 3 4 5 times a week. So to flip that, and I've talked about this on my podcast, I love to give people, you can still do cardio every day. I mean, there's so many, I'm never going to say like not do cardio. There's all the benefits that cardiovascular work can impart, but it's the type of cardio that you want to be thinking about. So maybe you want to do more low level steady state cardio more often. So that's a quicker recovery, right? So you're able to recover from that and do that more often. And maybe your HIIT training is like one time a week, maybe two, but for most women, it's like you start off with one and then you earn your second.
I think that's great because, there is the extreme of the chronic cardio, but then there's the extreme of you need to get off the couch.
Right. And
And
you've
then
got to
there's
do
somewhere in
something.
between.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so what would you say? So people in midlife, we know that we need to move and we also know that we need to have some strength training. What
Mhm.
would you say is a healthy, good type of working out
I think
regimen?
it's a combination of everything. I think resistance training is incredibly powerful. If we want to reinforce some of the things we were talking about before with having a healthy metabolic environment, one of the ways to do that is to build more muscle. So I mentioned that the liver and the muscles are the largest stores of glycogen, and muscle just by its mass, because it's like much larger than the liver, is going to have way more capacity. So it is just the glucose sink, right? It is just going to be the body is going to be able to deposit more glucose into the muscle than anywhere else. So the more muscle, and if you love your carbs, then maybe this is also another way of incentivizing you to build muscle, because you actually become more carbohydrate tolerant, right? The more muscle you have, the more carbs you can eat, because you're just that much more of an efficient glucose disposal agent. So I would say that resistance training is incredibly important for insulin regulation, cortisol regulation, in terms of looking good, right? Like muscles kind of shape you, right? So we can talk about the vein, and that's where I'm like, it's going to help your cortisol. People are like, I don't care. Is it going to, am I going to look good in a bikini? Yes, you're going to look good in a bikini. So if we can, get you working, I don't care what the motivator is, like as long as I can get you lifting weights, doing, even if you don't have like I know that's, where where people are listening to, like, a lot of gyms are closed now, but even if you're able to do your own body weight, like, you know how much good workout you can do just with your own, like, you can do jumping squats, and you can just do squats until you can do push-ups. There's so many things that we can do with just utilizing our own body weight that's going to build beautiful muscle, that's going to help with fat loss, is going to help you look better. And then as we move into menopause, this is also important as well, because generally, as estrogen, we see that stepwise attenuation in estrogen levels, we just naturally become more insulin resistant. And as we age, our muscles become more anabolically resistant. And what that means is that they're more resistant to growing. So you need to be
Mm.
working them more to even just to be able to maintain the amount of lean muscle mass that you currently have. You need to be working out. Um, there's like so many benefits to it, and a lot of times women who are going into menopause will say, oh, like, I have these hot flashes, and I'm a lot of times that can actually be pulled. We often want to blame our sex hormones, but so often it's because of this hyper insulinemic state. So if you can improve that by building out more muscle so that you can actually dispose of that glucose faster, your insulin levels don't need to have that prolonged um, a sustained release. So you will actually improve your insulin sensitivity. You're going to improve the way that you look, and you're going to improve some of the symptoms that we commonly see that are associated with menopause as well.
Oh, I love this. This is so helpful. Thank you so much. And I understand, I know we're in the new year, we're in January. When is your book coming out? You have a book. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, this is my other baby. So this is my first book. It's called The Betty Body. We named it after. So my podcast is called Better. So our fans are our Bettys. So we named it after our Betty fans. So it's The Betty Body, and it's talking a lot about what we've talked about here. So we're talking about intuitive eating, like learning how to appropriately respond when it is time to eat, when it's not time to eat, balancing your hormones. And then the other juicy bit is like using sex as a self actualization tool. So lots of sex and orgasms, doctor's orders. So it comes out February 16th, and you can, buy it anywhere that you would buy like any book. So like like online, in store, wherever.
Oh my gosh. Well, I cannot wait. I will be first in line. I'm going to be pre ordering. I'm really excited. And
Yes.
thank you so much for being here on the new mid.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.